in this part, we would like to talk about the Women's International War Crimes Tribunal on Japan's military sexual slavery that we organized, and also address how the tribunal was norm setting in relation to the international movement to end gender based violence. And we also do want to cover where we are now and how our movement and the tribunal relates to the current situations. Just as a refresher, I just want to give some facts of the organizing process that took place, and then Indai, you can really flesh out the spirit of it and the dynamism of it. So if you remember, there was an Asian Women's Solidarity Conference in April 1998 in Seoul, where the proposition to hold a public tribunal was presented. I think Yayori was who presented it from the perpetrator country. And support was established, and the decision to hold the tribunal was made then. And in February 1999, the International Organizing Committee for the Tribunal was formed at the preparatory conference in Korea. And the IOC, the International Organizing Committee, consisted of organizations and activists representing three parties, so victimized countries, represented by Yoon Chon-ok, who started this comfort women movement really, but based in Korea, who is Lee Hwa University, Women's University professor, who really broke out the story in Hangyoe newspaper in 1989. And second component is Japan as the offending country, and the international community as a third component, which Indai you represented. You were the co-convener. So victimized countries included North and South Korea, China, Taiwan, the Philippines, Malaysia, Indonesia, and the Netherlands. The International Advisory Committee for the Tribunal was established, represented by leading women human rights activist figures in the international women's human rights movement.
And I would like to mention their name because these are the women who supported us from different countries. So the members of the International Advisory Committee for the current war crimes was Ariane Brunet from Canada. We had Charlotte Mans from the United States, Florence Botegua from Uganda, Tina Dolgopol from Australia, of course, Alda Facio from Costa Rica, Eugenia Pizza Lopez, who is both from Argentina and UK. And then we have Marie-May Haley Lucas, who was from France and Algeria. And then Lepam Lajenovic from Serbia and Vahida Nainar from India.
And in addition, a couple of international law experts who were renowned for their contribution to gender and comfort women issues acted as legal advisors to the tribunal. And since that proposal was made, IOC met regularly in cities of organizing countries, including Tokyo, Seoul, Shanghai, Taipei, to discuss the rules and procedures, the statute of the tribunal, the charter of the tribunal, the participation of victims, selection of judges and experts in the tribunal, proceeding and funding activities. So the International Advisory Committee and legal advisors have met several times to advise on and to assist with the issues discussed at the IOC meetings. And every participating country has set up a preparatory committee to coordinate the participation of the tribunal. Research, evidence gathering, and documentation were undertaken at country level by victimized countries in coordination with research and investigation teams in Japan. They work together to look into war archives in the Japanese Imperial Military Army. And in addition, education and advocacy work was undertaken at both national and international levels to generate support for the comfort women issue, as well as the contemporary forms of violence against women in the context of the tribunal in every country, participating country. Um, and so that's just a prelude. I just wanted, so can you please address how the concept, how the tribunal was conceived and how the tribunal was organized?
Well, thank you, Miho, for expounding on the process of the tribunal. But I would like to add on to that because, the tribunal, when it was first organized, as you know went through in 1998 during those conferences that we would have in Seoul, yeah, the materialization of the idea was there 1998, but how to make it a tribunal went into a process. And I would like to link it because this was the time and the period that the establishment of the International Criminal Court was rolling within the United Nations. And I was already a part of the Women's Caucus for Gender Justice to the ICC in 97, 98. And during that period, the understanding of what the War Crimes Tribunal should be was very much into my system because I was attending the preparatory meetings in Rome as well as in New York. Then I told Yayori in one of our meetings in Geneva to talk about the tribunal at the Commission on Human Rights. And I said, if we are going to do this, we have to pattern the tribunal after the International Criminal Court, not just People's Tribunal, like the Bertrand Russell Tribunal, which was done in Belgium. I said, our tribunal has to be different. This has to be what a real, war crimes tribunal should be. And that is patterned after the International Criminal Court. And, Yayori immediately jumped into that idea. And that is when we started the whole process of identifying judges, identifying prosecutors. And then this is when all the victimized countries started to pull all their lawyers together to look at the prosecution in the context of the tribunal. But I think it should be investigated that our idea of the tribunal was simple from the start, which became much bigger than we thought. Because one, we have to draft the charter of the tribunal. And the charter is about laying out the rules and procedures like a legal court. The charter of the tribunal lays out the rules and procedures on how it will be run. Then the tribunal's prosecutors will have jurisdiction over the issues relating to the issue of sexual slavery and other forms of wartime sexual violence. Then the tribunal also has jurisdiction over both individuals and the states, and those identified responsible for the crimes, with emphasis on perpetrators in the high military and government position with command responsibility, including the emperor during that period. So we aim to clarify the charter that crimes committed before and during the Second World War. Yeah. So, and it was to prosecute the war criminals and to compensate the victims for the violence or for the crime committed against them. So it was really quite a process, I would say, because we are pushing for the responsibilities of the government of Japan to acknowledge the crime committed during the Second World War. Remember, we were going back to the establishment of the International Military Tribunal of the Far East that totally failed to recognize rape and sexual slavery during wartime. They were only looking at the crime committed, in terms of, massacres, but not sexual violence. So we were saying that the Women's International War Crimes Tribunal was an addendum to the International Military Tribunal of the Far East. This is a continuing, and this time we're prosecuting sexual slavery and sexual violence during wartime. So it is in this context that we decided to bring together, internationally well-known eminent persons and experts on international law to become judges, prosecutors, and expert witness. And, as I was saying, we have a movement with us that really supported the process. And so the chief prosecutors, which was, Patricia Busur-Sellers and Tina Dolgopol, came together to write a general indictment, drawing from the indictments submitted by the prosecutors of the participating countries. Then, of course, the panel of judges consisted of world-renowned persons. They were legal experts and former judges. So we have the Chief Judge, Gabriel Kirk MacDonald, who was the president of the Yugoslavia War Crimes Tribunal. Then we have Willy Mutunga, who was the only man. He was from Africa and from Kenya, actually, and the head of the Commission on Human Rights in Kenya. Then we have Christine Chinkins, who was a professor of gender and international law at London School of Economics. And then we have, of course, Carmen Argibe, who was a judge of the Supreme Court in Argentina. We still have two other judges from Asia, one from India, Judge Bagwati, but he wasn't able to come because he actually got sick 2 days before taking his flight out of Geneva. And then another one from Thailand who couldn't also make it for other reasons. So with these 4 judges, we were able to set up the tribunal. Now, I would just like to say that the objective of the tribunal was to restore justice and dignity to the victims and to pressure the Japanese government to take responsibility for crimes committed during the Second World War. Then the other objective was simple: to promote women's human rights, including the understanding of women's human rights in the context of international law, and more importantly, to prevent sexual violence of crimes committed against women. And of course, thirdly, we hope that this tribunal will lay down the groundwork for reconciliation among the Asian countries with Japan for the Second World War. But that, of course, was our own hope. That aim should also come from the government of Japan. So I would say that the preparatory process for the tribunal was really remarkable because of all these, people coming together, and looking at how we can really influence the issue of the comfort women, not only through the legal system, but also through education, but also to influence international law and humanitarian law, and to look at humanitarian law from a feminist perspective, from the perspective of the women who were victims and not recognized by international law. And I think that was the major shift, because our demand was to rewrite history, to rewrite even international humanitarian law from a feminist perspective that acknowledges violence and crimes done to women during the war. Because, as you know, the international law is very static. It does not really define, the immensity that 80% or 80% of the victims of war and armed conflict are women and children. And even up to now, in the present day, 80% of the refugees are women and children or internally displaced people because of conflict. So, we have much work to be done in this process. But as I was saying, there was solidarity in the preparation of the tribunal. That solidarity catapulted all the victimized countries to be united in one cause, and that was to prosecute Japan through the Women's Tribunal. Now, even if we acknowledge that the Women's Tribunal is organized by the NGOs, it does not have the legal authority to really prosecute the war criminals, because they were already prosecuted at the Military Tribunal of the Far East. But we are prosecuting them again for sexual slavery, rape, and mass rape during the Second World War. So the idea of prosecuting them again, because they were not prosecuted for sexual slavery, was a victory in itself, because we believe that it will be written into the history books. It will be written that since the Military Tribunal of the Far East failed, we are going to continue and address that failure, to correct that failure, to recognize crimes against women. And I think that is the most important part of it.
I hope, Indai, that you will document the tribunal so that you can capture and let the light that the Comfort Women survivors have given us and the light that we created run. And of course, it was no longer the perpetrator, the Japanese government, defining justice or denying justice, but it was the survivors and the activists who defined and realized justice, created justice.
Yeah, and I just hope that, in the years to come, we are still able to build that kind of movement that technically change, not only the normative framework in the United Nations to recognize women's rights as human rights, which has now evolved into gender equality and the empowerment of women, But during that time, I think we were more radical and in our approach, because it was not just gender equality, it was recognition of the violence and the crimes committed against women. And to recognize that, women's rights is the same rights as the men, and that alone was, it rattled, I would say, many of the governments to that women had the same rights as men. And I said, yeah, we do, So it was a process, but we fought for it as a movement and we won.
I also want to talk about sacrifices that I have witnessed among Japanese activists who supported the Comfort Women justice struggles. My mentor and leader of one of the leaders of Comfort Women movement in Japan, feminist activist Yayori Matsui. She was a former Asahi newspaper journalist. She was the first woman to be on the editorial board of Asahi newspaper. When she retired, she dedicated her life to feminist struggles, and she focused especially on the Japanese society and Japan's relation to women in Asia and around the world. And in the Comfort Women struggle, she was the co-convener of the Women's International War Crimes on Japan's military sexual slavery, together with Indai and Yunjanok. And after the tribunal, the tribunal judgment was delivered in 2001. And very quickly, it became a very much right-wing environment across the world, I think, with Bush and Cheney coming on board in Japan around the tribunal, and soon after the tribunal, we had ultra right-wing governments galvanizing a lot of right-wing forces. Yayori started to get threats of letters sent to her home, and she at some point she had to stay at different places other than her apartment, so she was carrying her suitcase everywhere, but still every day advocating and coming onto events and speaking and very active. And she traveled to Afghanistan one day, and she discovered that she had acute cancer. So she passed away in December 2003, a couple of years after that tribunal judgment. And I'm sure all of the threats and the stress factors always cause illnesses. It wasn't just Yayori, but there was Tatsue Takashima, for example, who was really leading the support for Filipina comfort women court case. She also developed acute leukemia, and she passed away a month after Yayori passed away. So everyone, it's not just Japanese women. So many activists, I'm sure every activist who was in the leadership position in victimized countries, in Japan, they have sacrificed quite a lot of their parts of their lives. Everyone has family, everyone carries important things, but this was a very demanding struggle. You had to really stand in the forefront of so many struggles up against Japanese government who continues to deny so there was a lot of sacrifice, but also tremendous gain.